Okay. Welcome to our webinar on measuring and evidencing the value in clusters with Madeleine Smith from Glasgow School of Art and Director with Smith Kelvin. Madeleine specialises in strategy and evaluation for clusters, innovation and triple helix collaborations. At GSA, she leads the research and enterprise strategy for the Innovation School, as well as the development and delivery of a portfolio of programs using design to build the innovative capacity of businesses, public sector organisations and communities. Initially training as an engineer, she has led large-scale improvement programs in private sector manufacturing environments, as well as strategic policy on innovation for regional development. Madeleine continues to work internationally on supporting cluster policy and evaluation. She is an active member of TCI, the Global Cluster and Innovation Practitioners Network, and leads their international working group on cluster evaluation. Today's topic area is challenges and approaches to evidencing value in clusters. Madeleine will discuss the challenges of evaluation for cluster programs and share some approaches on how to evidence the value of clusters and collaborative innovation. Madeleine's 2020 paper on evaluating where theory collides with practice, it is a link, it'll be shared at the end of today's session. We know that cluster policies are widely used to strengthen regional competitiveness, yet difficult to evaluate. As such, there remains a significant gap between the theory and practice. And for today, we will reflect on methodological approaches that bring together academics, policymakers, and practitioners to collectively address the challenges of cluster evaluation. Ground rules for today: Madeleine will present for about 30 minutes before opening up the discussion for joint exploration. We will have one breakout discussion during this, or breakout session during this time. And for now, everybody is muted and we encourage you to submit questions or comments via the chat function. Today's session is being recorded, and without further delay, I will pass you over to Madeleine and we will get started.
Thank you very much, Clodagh. Can you hear me okay? So yes, that's good. Yeah, perfect. That's good. Really delighted to be here with you today and to be joining you to talk about evaluation and clusters, a real challenge actually, because of the complexity of clusters. Then sometimes they're not simple to fit into our standard evaluation approaches. So we need to think about it in a slightly different way. As Claude has already said, I've had a varied background, but one of the things I like to think is that I came from industry, I worked in the private sector, I worked for regional development agencies, I'm now partly based in academia. So I am a real advocate for bringing all those different perspectives together to be able to all play to our strengths and work collectively on finding new solutions. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we face as part of cluster evaluation. As you'll all be well aware, cluster roots, it comes from Porter's observations in Italy about getting like-minded organizations together with a common issue. So you create these networks of organizations that include across that triple helix, those companies, the research organizations, the governmental organizations. And what happens is you start to get efficiencies, you start to be more effective because you're seeing those synergies. It acts as a self-reinforcing positive influence in the region, increasing its attractiveness. So all good. And why is that important? A lot of regions have started over the last couple of decades have really embraced clusters. And there's a good reason. The innovation performance in clusters is seen to be better when you look at it across a region, those who are engaged with clusters and those who aren't. Recently, with a couple of colleagues, we were looking, commissioned by Tillväxtverket in Sweden, the Swedish Agency for Economic and Regional Growth, to see, is there evidence out there that it has a positive effect on firms? And we looked at existing evaluation, we looked at academic literature, and largely came back with, yes, there is that positive evidence across a whole range of a number of effects. And more recently still, in some of the Interreg programs, there was some real evidence that clusters can bring around a positive effect. So overall, we're seeing a better performance. You can understand why policy makers and regions and national governments want to invest in clusters. However, despite how so many cluster initiatives and cluster policies around, there's not a lot of evaluation research, and there's certainly not consistent evaluation practice. So that opens up clusters continuously to challenge. The other thing is that for me, evaluation is all about learning. It shouldn't just be an audit. It's much more about saying, how can we do things better and how can we continue to do the things. And what that means is that this prevents learning for clusters, and it prevents learning about policy because you don't know what worked. One of the reasons why is that the impacts of clusters, they're quite hard to measure because it's pretty intangible and difficult to disaggregate from other things that we're doing. So very often clusters are about finding that space where you can tackle issues collectively, and that may only result in things happening in the longer term. It's all about building cluster dynamics around trust and social capital. That's quite difficult to evaluate. Also, clusters may have members, but very often they are regionally, territorially based. And even those who aren't members could get some of the benefits of having a cluster. They're also not isolated in their policy mix. There's other policies that interact with those competitiveness factors. And finally, clusters, there's not just one standard cluster. Clusters quite rightly have to be tailored to their context, to the sector, to the region, to the economy. And so as a result, there's not one size fits all. And that's a challenge for measurement and evaluation. What we quite like in evaluating projects is we did something and then we put it into the pipe and we measure what comes out the other end, and that's because of us. Whereas when you're looking at something as complex as a cluster, it's much more like fiddling with an ecosystem. So you're changing some aspects and you expect to see some effects, but you're not 100% convinced it's entirely because of you, because of other contexts. So the key thing around evaluation is it's about evidencing the difference we make. It shouldn't just be about audit. That's an aspect of it. It's also about learning, feeding back how we can improve. And if we get it right, it should help us improve our policy and our delivery at the same time. But as I say, it's quite a complex thing. It's not a simple equation. So we need to spend a bit of time understanding how it works, as well as what the final result is. One of the reasons, just to unpick a little about why there is that challenge. So in a standard impact logic model, we would be saying, well, we're putting in some resources at the beginning because of a policy decision. We've established a cluster organization, a cluster initiative, to try and drive forward some of this activity. It's all built around collaborative behaviors, so building linkages, building connections, doing things collectively and collaboratively. What we are anticipating is that will improve firm competitiveness and also improve the competitiveness of the region. The challenge is that we're not acting in isolation, so there are external contexts, external factors that are impacting on our sector or on our economy. Who knows, we've had a major lesson over the last 12 months in what external factors can do to our plans. The key thing about clusters is they're all built on collaboration and social capital. So it's all about the intangible human elements, and those are quite difficult to evidence. We are not alone in our policies. So we have innovation policies, we have skills policies, internationalization policies, etc., all of which impact on some of these contexts that we're dealing with. And we have to control for other factors, what's happening in the global economy, the local economy, what's happening in the sector, is there diversification? We also have a multi-level policy mix. So we might have it at the very local level, at a region, at a national and an international level. And also it takes time. These impacts do have a time lag. So how can we ensure that we continue to capture that? So some challenges really for cluster evaluation. And one of the reasons that I became so engaged with TCI is that I was going to some of the conferences with TCI, which is the global network for cluster and collaborative innovation practitioners and policymakers. And we were all talking about some of these challenges. So we set up the cluster evaluation working group, and we've run workshops. We've run a real working group every year since 2013, and also then run a session at the annual conference, so twice a year. And I'm going to have to get a bigger slide, I think, because now we're already planning our virtual workshop in 2021. And what we've done there is that we are all coming with this common challenge. We've tried new approaches. We've tried to articulate what the questions are, what some of the principles are that we're trying to address. And once again, we've brought those triple helix partners around this triple helix challenge. And that was, Clodagh had mentioned the article. We've collected some of that history and some of that story and recently published it, just so that so we could share, this is what we're working on and how we're trying to progress it. So let's have a think about what you need to encompass when you're thinking about a cluster evaluation. So first of all, you need to think about the why. Why have we got a cluster policy, a cluster intervention? And it's normally something about, we want to have a regional benefit, a regional impact. We want to capitalize on the capability we have in this sector with these assets. Then there's the actual what you do. So there will be cluster programs where you are intervening to build shared infrastructure, or to do joint training, or to have some internationalization programs collectively. And those will be slightly different depending on the cluster needs and the cluster opportunity. The key difference about excuse me, cluster policies and practice is it's all about the how. It's about building that partnership and collaboration. It's about building that social capital. So when you're doing your evaluation, you need to try and encompass a bit of all of this, or at least be clear, which bit am I focusing on? And then feed in, what are the indicators of progress that I'm going to be looking for across each of these. Excuse me. So for the why, that's likely to be quite long term, but it is going to be looking at some of those macro indicators and themes around jobs growth, around GVA growth, maybe about diversification, so changing industrial structure, transnational opportunities, but also increasingly looking at the environmental or the social impact, so more than economic. The actual cluster programs, that needs to be tailored to what are you trying to achieve within that business environment. Is it about enhancing physical access? Is it about finance and funding? Is it about talent attraction or nurturing skills? Whatever the programs are, that's what you're trying to say. Have we been doing this well? And the final aspect around partnerships and collaboration, that could be quite tactical and operational, about building linkages between business and universities, for example, or it could be quite strategic around aligning different policy agendas towards that common strategy. So you want to be looking about the types of partnerships, but also the depth of partnerships. And are you beginning to see some behavioural changes as that trust develops? So that's quite a complex framework, a complex picture. And also you've got to factor in some of the time lags in there and where you want to think about where you will see that impact. Just to add even more complication, because of that time lag, you've got some things which will happen in the short term, but others which will take an awful long time to come to fruition. So we've got things that are under direct control. We'll be delivering some particular activities that will have some immediate impact. Outputs. But then we might want to be looking at slightly longer outcomes around our regional sector and the changes we'll see there. Finally, looking at the longer term impact, which may be about shifts in the overall in the why, or changing policy, or changing diversification within a region. And those external factors, the things that are outside of our control, the longer it goes on, the more it has an impact on how we actually capture that impact. So one of the things that's a challenge is that when we're looking at direct control, we can really show that that's our activity that have led to those outputs. That's real strong attribution. However, when we come to the longer term outcomes and the impact, that's much more likely to be we contributed to these changes. We can't necessarily show a real cause down to our individual activities, but we know because we were trying to change things in this area and that has changed, we have contributed to it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that scope of influence because I think it's an area that we're becoming increasingly aware of in clusters and that we're not very good at evidencing. We tend to only think about the direct impacts. But that's good. We do cluster projects, we deliver some things and we want to know what that direct effect is. There's also, as I say, some immediate spillover effects. So others in the region, others in the sector may be getting some benefit, some increased talent coming into the region, better infrastructure. That can all have an impact on those spillover effects. The areas which I think we've more recently realized are a really strong asset of a cluster organization and a cluster policy are those strategic leadership effects. So you become a catalyst for other action because there is a strong cluster working positively in that region. It may be that you are an anchor for certain physical activity or certain investments, and that attracts others. Certainly becomes a reason for external investment, whether that be talent or companies coming into the region. The other aspect, though, is you become a credible voice. You are the voice of the industry and also an opportunity for that voice to be heard because you can amplify the individual company voices into something that's much more powerful when you work collectively. And the cluster can be a real source of industry intelligence. What is happening on the ground that can inform policy? And I think that's an area that we haven't really articulated as well as we could have, because it's quite a powerful value that the cluster organizations and cluster policy are delivering. The final sort of area, that scope of influence, is also something we're seeing increasingly. As well as economic impact, many cluster organizations and cluster policies are trying to address a regional improvement in other impacts, in other aspects. So things like environmental performance, things like social cohesion, diversity that you might see. So all of those aspects have a real impact in the region, but they're not necessarily measured directly in economic factors. So increasingly, because of things like sustainable development goals, clusters are asked, and what is your contribution to these other higher level system effects, as well as the economic effects that you're more directly attributed to. So these things, I think, are a broader value that clusters are delivering, and we need to include them within our valuation to show the return on investment that we're delivering. Right, that's me having already begun to lose my voice for talking for a while. So I've got a couple of questions for you. As Claudia said, there's a little bit of a breakout session for you to have a discussion. I suppose with the clusters, organizations or cluster policies or clusters that you're engaged with, just have a little bit of a reflection of how much of your reporting is just about activity, this is what we did, as opposed to the outcome, this is what we changed. And what aspects of those wider levels of influence are you delivering, do you think, in your cluster? And do you measure any of them? Do you capture any of them? So those would be interesting things for you to have a bit of a discussion about and a reflection. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about trust. So collaboration is at the heart of cluster building, those whole human element aspects. And one of the challenges is that it's a really important aspect of cluster building, but it's really hard. It is very often very often suspicion is the initial starting point, particularly for those who are working in a competitive sector. Not always, but certainly in many environments, they start as to why should I be sharing. So you need to start to build that and show the benefits of moving through that trust, that sort of trust building loops, which Huxley and Wangham, who I quote here, is talk about, that you do a little bit and then actually that works, so you do a bit more because you're willing to, you've built the trust with those partners. But it is quite a challenge. And one of the things that we've been looking at is over a number of different evaluations is how do you tell that collaboration journey? So you start off in the cluster when you initially when you do mapping and you say what strengths have I got in that region? Is this a fertile ground for a cluster policy? Then you look at the companies that you've got in your region in certain sector. So really, it's just a collection. There's nothing other than finding them up. And from an evaluation point of view, particularly for policymakers, we still tend to say what is now our GVA for our companies in the cluster, and we add it up. It completely misses the bit about what's the added value of collaboration, which is what the cluster is investing in. So trying to find a way to articulate that change in journey. As you move from a collection, you start to share information. You maybe start to do some low-level, non-risky participation together, and that continues to build the trust to the extent that in the end, you are working really deeply, collaboratively, taking risks together, but doing together what you can't do on your own. And that's the added value of clusters. How can you look at that journey from collection through to cluster? And one of the things that is sometimes quite useful as part of an evaluation is to think as a board, as a cluster board, or as a group of cluster members, where are we in that collaboration journey, and what do we need to do next to take us into that deeper level? And we have tried to address some of those aspects as part of the TCI Cluster Evaluation Working Group by saying, how could we build a survey tool that could go in the cluster evaluation surveys, for example, and try and show some of those changes in behavior around the human element. So we looked at what might be the dimensions of that human element. And one aspect is the linkages. So you're looking at who you're connecting to and enabling those connections around collaboration, knowledge sharing, etc. Then you look about how deep are those collaborations going? Are we starting at quite a lower level, but then beginning to say there are real benefits to collective action? And then there's that third bit, which is around that leadership role, where there is a general commitment that working together around a shared identity, a shared vision, a credible collective voice, and a real belief in collective action, that is something that we all buy into. So those were the things that we identified as maybe separate dimensions. And we tried to build some indicators against each of these, which we could test through evaluation surveys, looking at engagement, trust, commitment, and shared identity. And we tried to, what we did is we designed a few questions that could go into a wider evaluation question. Because very often as part of a cluster evaluation, you'll have a member survey. So could we find a few questions that we could add in? We tested it in a number of different regions just to see if we could get some positive results. One of the regions that we tested it in is one close to my heart, which is Scotland Food and Drink. They were doing a big activity around strategy development, and as part of that, they were evaluating not only their activity, but also their leadership role, because they really had tried to take a strong leadership role in the Scotland Food and Drink sector. The results from Scotland Food and Drink, we got some very positive results, that the company's perceptions, their feedback, the benefits of social capital, that shared vision, the value of collective action was very, very positive. And we did that evaluation with both members and non-members, and the members saw even greater benefit. But even the non-members saw that it was good to have a leadership body taking forward some of those collective actions. And then we also looked at where had the linkages happened and what new connections had come about. And one of the things that was really interested in is, did they see that return on investment? Given that collaboration and trust building takes time and is hard, were they seeing the return on investment? And we've got some very positive feedback around the value of those collaborations that the companies viewed. Took some of those feedback. It was one of many aspects of evidence that went into building the strategy for Scotland Food and Drink. And one of the things I was most proud of, because I was also worked with them to help build their strategy, was that collaboration is at the core of what they're trying to do. It's helped sort of drive forward some of the national now funding towards that leadership role, as well as the activity that they deliver. So we piloted it in a couple of different regions. Scotland Food and Drink is one. We also worked in the Basque Country, in Colombia as well. They tested the survey, and most recently we've been working with the Welsh Government, integrating it with some of their evaluations. I think one of the key things was around it showed the evidence about the value of collaboration, and that the companies saw that value. And I think if funders and stakeholders are looking to invest in that leadership role of the cluster, this shows the return on investment for that, the value that collaboration, the importance of collaboration, really begins to be evidenced. However, those were just a few pilot regions. We're always open to new and interesting clusters if you're interested in also building that into your wider evaluations. Just going to talk a little bit about there's a whole range of data that we can use. It is amazing the amount of information that we have coming through our companies, coming through our regions, that we deal with as part of cluster policy and practice. And we, as part of evaluation, we need to try and make a bit of sense around that. We need to take all that data and really draw out the information and knowledge to be able to inform what we do next, which is why evaluation is part of the informing the strategy and learning for what we do next. I want to talk a little bit though about indicators and targets, because very often we get given targets to achieve, and we need to make sure that those are relevant key performance indicators for our objectives. And as a little story, I'll talk about my friend the owl here. So someone shared with me this example, which I thought was a really good example of the difference between an indicator and a target. So the key thing about an indicator is it must show how you are delivering your objectives, and you mustn't forget what are your overall objectives. If, as an example, you are in charge of a woodland, so your responsibility is to make that woodland, that ecosystem, as productive and as purposeful and as healthy as it possibly can. So a really good indicator of that objective, the success of that objective, is the number of owls that you have living in your woodland, because the owls are at the top of the food chain. They eat they hunt the rodents that eat the insects that live in the detritus that falls from a healthy woodland. So owls are a really good indicator of a healthy woodland, which is your objective. If you make owls your target, then suddenly all sorts of strange things happen. You might want to bring in additional owls externally just to boost your numbers. You may clear the detritus from underneath the woodland to make it easier for owls to hunt. And not that you intended to, but you've undermined that ecosystem. And before you know it, you don't have a healthy woodland. You might have high owl numbers, but that isn't really your objective. It's just an indicator. So there's a real challenge about the difference between having a target and focusing on that and forgetting your overall objective. So be very careful with targets. Indicators, however, can be a real way of tracking your journey towards your final strategy. So what is it you're trying to achieve? What is it that your overall objectives, your success that you would see for your cluster? And how can you put in place indicators that show you are progressing, because it may take quite a while before you reach those final objectives. Just as a final thing, I'm just going to flag up a couple of things that are happening, hopefully, for any cluster evaluation enthusiasts out there that might want to engage the TCI Cluster Evaluation Working Group. We're going to have another meeting in April, virtual meeting. It'll be a webinar looking at some of the, maybe how have we captured the value we've added during COVID? Because there's all sorts of things that clusters have really stepped up to, and are we evaluating those in a proper way? Some of the outputs from that paper and from the work we did in Sweden, we're looking to say, can we set up some kind of evaluation toolkit that people can draw from, a framework that can help guide people as they're setting up their evaluation process. And we're trying to capture those within further journal articles. My final point is you really do, this is a triple helix problem by bringing clusters together, and you need the perspectives from all parts of the triple helix to address that challenge. Because if you only do it from a policymaker's point of view or from a researcher's point of view, you might miss the practical application from an industry point of view. You need all those different views in to address that challenge. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm very happy to take any questions.